I never thought I'd be running through the woods at 2 in the morning with my cousin Jake, both of us wearing stolen jackets and carrying nothing but a backpack each. But there we were, 17 and 15 years old, breathing hard as we put distance between ourselves and Riverside Reformatory, the place that had been our prison for the last 8 months. The facility sat on the edge of town, like a grey monument to teenage mistakes, and we'd just become 2 more statistics in their escape records. My name is Marcus, and if you'd told me a year ago that I'd end up in a place like Riverside, I would have laughed in your face. I was a good student, played basketball, had friends, a normal life in Seattle. But one stupid decision, one night of following the wrong crowd, and suddenly I was being sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile facility for breaking and entering. Jake got caught up in something similar back in Portland, some mess with his older brother's friends that went sideways. Our parents were siblings who'd grown up together, and somehow fate decided to throw us both into the same reformatory 3 states away in rural Montana. The thing about places like Riverside is that they're supposed to rehabilitate you, make you a better person, teach you responsibility and consequences. What they actually do is stuff you into overcrowded dormitories with kids who've done way worse things than you, feed you food that barely qualifies as edible, and treat you like you're already a lost cause. The guards were either burned out and didn't care, or they enjoyed the power trip a little too much. There was this one guy, Officer Hendricks, who seemed to take personal pleasure in making our lives miserable. He'd find reasons to dock our privileges, extend our stays for minor infractions, and generally act like we were beneath him. Jake and I became close in there, closer than we'd been as kids at family reunions. When you're stuck in a place like that, you need someone you can trust, someone who has your back. We'd spend hours in the rec room talking about what we'd do when we got out, where we'd go, how we'd never let ourselves end up in a situation like this again. But as the months dragged on, something shifted. Jake started hearing rumors that they were planning to separate us, send him to a different facility because of some administrative reshuffling. The thought of losing the one person who made that place bearable was too much for both of us. That's when we started planning. It wasn't some elaborate movie plot with blueprints and inside accomplices. It was desperate and scrappy and honestly pretty stupid in retrospect. But we were kids who felt like we had nothing left to lose. Jake had been working in the facility's maintenance department, which gave him access to areas most inmates never saw. He'd noticed that one of the emergency exit doors in the basement had a faulty alarm system, something the staff kept meaning to fix, but never got around to. We spent 3 weeks observing guard rotations, memorizing schedules, and stashing supplies whenever we could. The night we left, there was a storm rolling in. Thunder rumbled in the distance as we slipped out of our bunks at 1:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after the night guard completed his rounds. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might give us away. We moved through the darkened hallways like ghosts, every creak of the floorboards sounding like an explosion in the silence. When we reached the basement door, I held my breath as Jake worked on the lock with a piece of bent wire he'd been shaping for weeks. The click when it opened was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Then we ran. We ran through the rain that had started to fall, ran through the woods that bordered the facility's property, ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they might give out. We didn't have a plan beyond getting away. We hadn't thought about where we'd go or how we'd survive. All we knew was that we couldn't go back and we couldn't go home. Our families would be the first place they'd look, and we'd just bring trouble to their doorsteps after everything we'd already put them through. By the time dawn started to break, we were miles away from Riverside, standing on the shoulder of a 2-lane highway that cut through farmland and forest. We looked like exactly what we were, 2 scared kids in 2 big jackets with mud on their shoes and no idea what came next. That's when Jake pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, something I hadn't known he was carrying. It was an old property deed, yellowed and torn at the edges, with an address written in faded ink. "My grandfather's place," Jake said, his voice hoarse from running. "He died when I was 8 and the property went into some kind of legal limbo with the state. Nobody's been there in years. It's about 30 miles northeast of here, middle of nowhere. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to figure things out. I looked at the paper, then at my cousin, then back at the empty road stretching out before us. We were fugitives now, and that word carried weight I was only beginning to understand. But what choice did we have? Going back meant more time in that place, maybe even getting transferred to somewhere worse. Going forward meant uncertainty, but at least it meant freedom, even if it was the kind of freedom that came with constantly looking over your shoulder. We started walking, sticking to the tree line whenever we could, ducking into the brush whenever we heard a car approaching. The rain had stopped, but everything was wet and cold, and I could feel blisters forming on my heels. Jake shared an energy bar he'd stolen from the cafeteria, and we split a bottle of water we'd filled up before leaving. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. As we walked, we talked about the farm, about what we might find there, about how we could make it work even temporarily. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge the bigger question looming over everything. What happens when they catch us? Because they would catch us eventually. They always did. It took us 3 days to reach the farm, 3 days of walking back roads, sleeping in abandoned barns, and scrounging for food wherever we could find it. We broke into a gas station convenience store after hours and grabbed whatever we could carry, protein bars and chips and bottled water, enough to keep us going. I felt guilty about it, adding theft to our growing list of crimes. But Jake reminded me that we were already escaped convicts, and hunger doesn't care about your moral compass. By the time we finally spotted the property marker Jake's grandfather had described to him years ago, a weathered wooden post with faded numbers carved into it, we were exhausted, filthy, and running on fumes. The farm itself was more rundown than either of us had imagined. The main house stood at the end of a long dirt driveway, its windows broken out and its front porch sagging dangerously to one side. The barn behind it had partially collapsed, its red paint peeled away to grey wood underneath. Overgrown fields stretched out in every direction, reclaimed by wild grass and weeds that came up to our waists. It looked like the kind of place people passed by without a second glance, which was exactly what we needed. Nobody would think to look for us here, because nobody remembered this place existed. We spent the first few hours just exploring, trying to get a sense of what we were working with. The house was a lost cause, too visible from the road and too damaged to be livable. The barn wasn't much better, but it had a loft area that was still structurally sound, and we figured we could camp there temporarily if we needed to. But Jake was fixated on something else. Behind the barn, almost completely hidden by a tangle of blackberry bushes and young trees, was an old root cellar his grandfather had built decades ago. The entrance was just a wooden door set into a small hillside, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. When we pulled open that door, the hinges screaming in protest, we found a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. Jake used his lighter to illuminate the space, and what we saw made us look at each other with the same thought. This could work. The cellar was about 12 feet by 15 feet, with walls made of stacked stone and a dirt floor that had stayed remarkably dry despite years of neglect. There were old wooden shelves along one wall, still sturdy, and the ceiling was high enough that we could stand upright. It was cool down there, almost cold, but it was hidden, defensible, and most importantly, it was ours. That's when we made the decision that would define the next 6 months of our lives. We weren't just going to hide out here temporarily and then move on. We were going to build something real, something sustainable. We were going to turn this forgotten root cellar into a proper shelter, a place where we could actually live while we figured out what came next. It was insane and ambitious and probably impossible. But we were 17 and 15, with nothing but time and desperation driving us forward. The work started immediately. We spent days clearing out the cellar, hauling out decades of accumulated debris, old jars, broken tools, and the remains of what might have once been stored vegetables. We used branches and boards from the collapsed sections of the barn to reinforce the ceiling, working by flashlight and the dim, natural light that filtered down the stairs. Jake had picked up enough construction knowledge from his time in maintenance at Riverside to have a rough idea of what we needed to do. I had enthusiasm and a strong back, which turned out to be almost as valuable. Our biggest problem was supplies. We had almost no money, just the $73 Jake had managed to steal from a guard's locker before we escaped, and that wouldn't get us far. So we became scavengers, combing through the abandoned buildings on the property and venturing out to nearby abandoned farms under cover of darkness. We found insulation in an old shed, tarps in a collapsed garage, and even some canned goods in a farmhouse that had been sitting empty for years. We stole when we had to, took what was left behind when we could, and made do with whatever we found. Water was our first major challenge. The old well on the property still worked, which felt like a miracle, but we had to boil everything before drinking it. We set up a makeshift fire pit in the barn and used old pots we'd found to purify water, then carried it down to the cellar in whatever containers we could find. Food was harder. The protein bars we'd stolen were long gone, and the canned goods we'd found were running low. Jake suggested we try hunting, and even though neither of us had any experience, we fashioned crude snares from wire we found in the barn. To our shock, we actually caught a rabbit on the third day. Neither of us had ever killed or cleaned an animal before, and it was brutal and sad and necessary all at once. As the weeks passed, the cellar started to transform. We'd managed to create a ventilation system using PVC pipes we'd salvaged and positioned to draw fresh air from outside while venting the stale air from our fire pit. We built crude furniture from reclaimed wood, a table, 2 chairs, and sleeping platforms that kept us off the cold ground. We even rigged up a basic lighting system using car batteries we'd found in an abandoned truck and some LED strips Jake knew how to wire together. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't pretty, but it was ours, and every improvement felt like a victory. But living like this took a toll. We were constantly hungry, never quite warm enough, and always looking over our shoulders. Every time we heard a car on the distant road, we'd freeze and listen, waiting to hear if it was slowing down, if it was coming for us. We took turns keeping watch at night, sleeping in shifts, never both of us fully resting at the same time. The isolation was crushing. We couldn't risk going into town, couldn't contact our families, couldn't connect to the world in any meaningful way. It was just the two of us in our underground hideout, day after day, week after week. The loneliness did something to our minds. We'd have the same conversations over and over, tell the same stories, laugh at the same jokes that weren't even funny anymore. Sometimes we'd fight over nothing, stupid arguments that would blow up because we had no one else to direct our frustration toward. Then we'd apologize and remember that we only had each other, and the fights would settle into an uncomfortable silence that felt almost worse than the shouting. Jake started scratching marks into the stone wall to count the days, and watching those marks accumulate was both reassuring and terrifying. Hey, if you're still watching this, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, stories about survival and desperation and the crazy things people do when they're backed into a corner, these are the stories I want to keep sharing with you. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever been in a situation where you had to make an impossible choice? What did you do? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories. You're not just watching a video, you're part of a community of people who understand that life isn't always clean and simple. So subscribe, comment, and let's keep this conversation going. Winter hit Montana like a hammer, and we were completely unprepared for it. We'd known it was coming, had seen the leaves change, and felt the temperature drop. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically are two completely different things. The first real snowfall came in mid-November, and suddenly our underground shelter went from feeling like a clever hideout to feeling like a tomb. The cold seeped through the stone walls and settled into our bones, and no amount of fire could seem to push it back. We'd pile on every piece of clothing we'd scavenged, wrap ourselves in the tarps and old blankets we'd found, and still wake up shivering in the middle of the night. The snow changed everything about our survival strategy. We couldn't venture out as freely anymore because we'd leave tracks, clear evidence that someone was living on the abandoned property. Our hunting snares became useless because the animals had either migrated or gone into hibernation, and the plants we'd been supplementing our diet with were buried under 2 feet of snow. We were burning through our stored supplies faster than we'd anticipated, and the math was becoming impossible to ignore. We had maybe 3 weeks of food left if we rationed carefully, and after that, we'd be facing a choice between starvation and risking exposure by going into town. Jake became obsessed with improving our shelter's insulation. He'd spend hours packing snow against the outer walls of the cellar entrance, creating a kind of igloo effect that actually helped retain heat. He found old newspapers in the farmhouse and stuffed them between the boards we'd used for our ceiling, creating additional layers against the cold. He even dug deeper into the floor of the cellar, creating a small pit where the coldest air would settle, keeping the main living area slightly warmer. I watched him work with this manic energy, and I realized he was doing it to avoid thinking about the bigger problem. We were trapped, and we were running out of time. I started keeping a journal around this time, writing on the backs of old farm documents we'd found in the house. I needed something to do with my hands and my mind during the long hours when it was too cold to do anything but sit huddled by our small fire. I wrote about our escape, about building the shelter, about what it felt like to be 16 years old and living like a fugitive in an underground bunker. I wrote letters to my mom that I knew I'd never send, trying to explain why I'd run, trying to make her understand that I wasn't a bad person, just a scared kid who'd made a series of increasingly terrible decisions. Sometimes Jake would ask me what I was writing, and I'd make up something funny or dismissive because I didn't know how to tell him that I was documenting our slow descent into desperation. The turning point came on a night in early December when the temperature dropped to 15 below zero. We'd run out of propane for our camp stove 2 days earlier and were completely dependent on the wood fire we kept burning in a makeshift hearth Jake had built. But the wood we'd stockpiled was running low, and it was too dangerous to go out and gather more in the deep snow. We huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat under every blanket and tarp we owned, and I remember thinking that this might be it. This might be how our story ends. 2 teenage boys freezing to death in an underground shelter because they were too proud or too scared to ask for help. But we survived that night, and the next morning brought a strange kind of clarity. We couldn't keep doing this. We couldn't keep pretending that we could outlast winter with no resources and no plan. Jake and I sat across from each other at our crude wooden table, and for the first time since we'd escaped, we had a completely honest conversation about our situation. We were starving, we were freezing, we were losing hope, and most importantly, we were starting to realize that running away hadn't solved any of our problems. It had just created new ones that were potentially fatal. That's when we started talking about the idea that had been lurking in the back of both our minds for weeks, but neither of us had wanted to voice. What if we turned ourselves in? Not back to Riverside, but to someone else. Maybe a lawyer or a social worker, or even just the local sheriff. What if we told our story, explained why we ran, made our case that the conditions at Riverside were what drove us to escape in the first place? It was a long shot, and it would probably mean facing serious consequences, but at least we'd be alive. At least we wouldn't be slowly dying in a hole in the ground. But before we could act on any of that, something unexpected happened. We'd been so careful about staying hidden, about not leaving any trace of our presence on the property. But hunger makes you careless, and desperation makes you take risks you know are stupid. Jake had ventured out in the middle of the day to check a snare line we'd set up near the edge of the property, and he'd been spotted. A local farmer, a man named Tom Pritchard who owned the adjacent land, had been driving by and seen movement near the old barn. He'd stopped to investigate, thinking maybe it was kids from town messing around or vagrants looking for shelter. Jake made it back to the cellar and warned me, and we spent the next 2 hours in complete silence, sitting in the darkness with our fire extinguished, barely breathing, waiting to hear if someone was coming. And someone did come. We heard footsteps above us, heavy boots crunching through the snow. We heard a man's voice calling out, asking if anyone was there, saying he wasn't going to call the police, he just wanted to help. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to climb those stairs and accept whatever help he was offering, but we'd been running for so long that trust felt impossible. Tom Pritchard didn't find our cellar that day. The entrance was too well hidden, and he eventually gave up and left. But he'd left something behind, and when we cautiously emerged hours later to investigate, we found a plastic bag hanging on a nail near the barn entrance. Inside were sandwiches, a thermos of hot soup, a package of batteries, and a note written on a torn piece of notebook paper. The note said, "I don't know who you are or why you're here, but it's too cold for anyone to be living rough like this. There's more food and some blankets in the barn loft if you need them. If you want help, real help, come to the house at 447 County Road. If you don't, I won't tell anyone I saw you. Stay safe." We stood there in the snow, reading that note over and over, and I felt something crack inside my chest. It was kindness, unexpected and undeserved, from a complete stranger who had no reason to care about two runaway kids hiding on abandoned property. Jake was crying, which I'd never seen him do, not even during our worst nights in Riverside. We took the food back down to the cellar and ate those sandwiches slowly, savoring every bite, and we didn't talk about what the note meant or what we should do about it. We just ate and felt warm for the first time in weeks, and remembered what it was like to be treated like human beings instead of criminals. The next few days were spent in agonizing debate. Should we trust Tom Pritchard? Was this a trap? Had he already called the authorities and was just trying to keep us in place until they arrived? Or was he genuinely offering help with no strings attached? Jake was skeptical, convinced it had to be some kind of setup, but I kept thinking about that note, about the tone of it, about someone taking the time to leave food and supplies for anonymous strangers. That wasn't the action of someone trying to set a trap. That was compassion, pure and simple. In the end, it was hunger that made our decision for us. Our supplies were completely depleted, and the food Tom had left was gone within 36 hours. We were facing the reality that we either accepted his help or we started the long, dangerous journey into town to steal more food, which would inevitably lead to our capture. On a grey afternoon in mid-December, exactly 4 months after our escape from Riverside, Jake and I climbed out of our underground shelter, brushed the snow off our stolen jackets, and started walking toward 447 County Road. The walk to Tom Pritchard's house felt like the longest mile of my life. Every step through the snow felt heavy, weighted down not just by exhaustion, but by the knowledge that we were about to put our fate in the hands of a complete stranger. Jake kept stopping, turning around like he was going to bolt back to the cellar, and I'd have to convince him to keep going. We'd survived this long on our own, built something out of nothing, proved we could make it without anyone's help. But pride doesn't keep you warm, and stubbornness doesn't fill your stomach. We needed help, and for the first time since Riverside, we were admitting it. Tom Pritchard's farmhouse was nothing fancy, just a single-story ranch-style home with smoke curling from the chimney and a well-maintained yard despite the snow. There were 2 trucks in the driveway and a doghouse near the porch, though we didn't see any dog. We stood at the end of his driveway for a solid 10 minutes, just staring at that house, before Jake finally said what we were both thinking. Once we knock on that door, there's no going back. Whatever happens next, we lose control. No, I nodded, and then I started walking toward the porch, because sometimes the only way forward is to stop thinking and start moving. Tom answered the door before we even knocked, like he'd been watching through the window and waiting. He was in his mid-50s, weathered skin and calloused hands, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He didn't look surprised to see us, didn't look scared or angry or judgmental. He just looked at two skinny, dirty teenage boys standing on his porch in inadequate clothing, and he stepped aside and said, "Come in before you freeze to death out there." It was the simplest kindness, and it nearly broke me. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like coffee and something baking in the oven. Tom led us to his kitchen table and told us to sit down, and then he started moving around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out bread and cheese and leftover chicken, building sandwiches without asking if we were hungry, because our hollow cheeks and desperate eyes already told him everything he needed to know. He set the plates in front of us, along with glasses of milk, and then he sat down across from us and said, "I'm not going to ask who you are or where you came from. Not yet. First you eat, then we talk." We devoured that food like animals. No manners, no self-consciousness, just pure, desperate hunger. Tom kept refilling our glasses and bringing out more food. Cookies his wife had made before she passed away 2 years ago, he told us. Frozen casseroles he heated up in the microwave. Anything to put calories into us. When we finally slowed down, when our stomachs were full for the first time in weeks, he poured himself a cup of coffee and said, "Okay, now you can tell me your story, and I want the truth, all of it, because I can't help you if I don't know what we're dealing with." So we told him. We told him about Riverside, about the conditions there, about Officer Hendricks and the threat of separation and the desperation that led to our escape. We told him about finding the farm, building the shelter, surviving for 4 months on our own. We told him everything, holding nothing back, because something about Tom Pritchard made us feel like we could trust him. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was just that we'd been carrying these secrets for so long that it felt good to finally share the weight with someone else. When we finished, Tom was quiet for a long time, just staring into his coffee cup like he was looking for answers there. Finally, he spoke. "You boys did something incredibly stupid and incredibly brave, and I'm not sure which one outweighs the other, but here's what I know. Winter in Montana will kill you if you keep living in that cellar. And running for the rest of your lives isn't living at all. It's just slow dying in a different form." He paused, took a sip of coffee, and continued. "I'm going to make you an offer, and you can take it or leave it. No judgment either way. You can stay here in my house while we figure out the right way to handle this situation. I've got a spare room. It's small, but it's warm. You'll eat regular meals, do some work around the farm to earn your keep, and we'll contact a lawyer I know who specializes in juvenile cases. We'll tell your story properly, through legal channels, and see if we can't find a better solution than sending you back to that place." Jake and I looked at each other, having an entire conversation with just our eyes. This could be a trap. This could be the end of our freedom. But it could also be exactly what Tom said it was, a chance to stop running, to face our situation head-on instead of hiding from it. And honestly, we were too tired to keep fighting, too cold, too hungry, too worn down by months of survival mode to maintain our defenses any longer. So we accepted Tom's offer, and just like that, our time as fugitives living in an underground shelter came to an end. The next few weeks were surreal. Living in a real house again, sleeping in an actual bed, eating 3 meals a day, it all felt like a dream after months in the cellar. Tom put us to work immediately, nothing exploitative, just honest farm labor that kept us busy and gave us purpose. We fixed fences, mucked out the horse stalls, chopped firewood, and helped with general maintenance around the property. The work was hard, but satisfying in a way that our desperate survival activities never had been. We were building something productive instead of just trying not to die. True to his word, Tom contacted his lawyer friend, a woman named Patricia Chen, who drove out from Billings to meet with us. She was sharp and no-nonsense, and she didn't sugarcoat the reality of our situation. We were fugitives from a state facility, and there would be consequences for that. But she also saw value in our story, in documenting the conditions at Riverside and using our case to push for reforms. She started building a defense strategy that acknowledged our escape while highlighting the circumstances that led to it. She filed motions, contacted juvenile advocates, and started a paper trail that would eventually lead to a formal investigation of Riverside Reformatory. During this time, Tom became something none of us expected, a father figure. He'd lost his own son years ago in a car accident, and I think helping us filled some void in his life, just as his help filled the voids in ours. He taught us things our own fathers hadn't, practical skills like how to fix an engine, how to read the weather, how to be self-sufficient in ways that didn't involve breaking the law. He also taught us about responsibility and consequences, about how running from your problems just creates new problems, about how real courage isn't escaping from hard situations but facing them head-on. My parents were contacted through Patricia, and that phone call was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Hearing my mum's voice after 4 months, hearing her cry and tell me how worried she'd been, how she'd thought I was dead, it destroyed me. But it also reminded me that I had people who loved me, people who'd been suffering because of my choices. Jake had a similar conversation with his parents, and afterward we both sat in Tom's living room in silence, processing the weight of what we'd put our families through. Running away had felt like freedom, but it had really just been selfishness, disguised as survival. The authorities were eventually notified, of course, there was no way around that, but Patricia had arranged it so that instead of being immediately sent back to Riverside, we'd be placed in a temporary foster situation under Tom's supervision while our case went through the system. It wasn't freedom, not really, but it was better than going back to that place. And more importantly, our story was being heard. News outlets picked up on the case of 2 teenagers who'd escaped a reformatory and survived for months in an underground shelter. And suddenly, people were asking questions about conditions at facilities like Riverside. The legal process that followed was long and complicated, filled with court dates and depositions and interviews with social workers who wanted to understand every detail of our story. Patricia Chen was relentless in her advocacy, bringing in former Riverside inmates to testify about the conditions there, documenting the facility's violations, and building a case that our escape, while illegal, was a desperate response to an intolerable situation. The media attention helped, putting pressure on the state to actually investigate, rather than just sweep everything under the rug and throw us back into the system. Jake and I spent 6 months living with Tom while the legal machinery ground slowly forward. Those months changed us in ways I'm still trying to understand. We went from being desperate fugitives to being teenage boys with structure and support and a genuine chance at a future. Tom enrolled us in the local high school under special circumstances, and going back to regular classes felt bizarre after everything we'd been through. We were behind in our coursework, obviously, but we worked hard to catch up, driven by this newfound appreciation for the opportunity to just be normal kids again. The investigation into Riverside Reformatory eventually confirmed what Jake and I had been saying all along. The facility was understaffed, overcrowded, and operating with minimal oversight. Officer Hendricks, the guard who'd made our lives so miserable, was found to have multiple complaints against him that had been ignored by administration. The separation plan that had triggered our escape turned out to be based on arbitrary decisions rather than any legitimate rehabilitative strategy. The state ended up placing the facility under probationary status and implementing a series of reforms that should have been in place from the beginning. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was acknowledgement that we hadn't been wrong about what we'd experienced. Our own sentencing came down in late spring, almost a full year after our initial escape. The judge who heard our case was a woman named Margaret Sullivan, who'd spent 20 years in family court and had seen every variation of teenage trouble imaginable. She listened to our testimonies, reviewed the evidence about Riverside, considered the letters of support from Tom and our teachers, and even some of our fellow former inmates. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of sending us back to any facility, she sentenced us to supervised probation with mandatory community service and counseling. We'd remain in Tom's care, finish high school, and spend our weekends working with at-risk youth programs, sharing our story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of bad decisions and the importance of asking for help before things spiral out of control. Walking out of that courthouse with Tom, knowing we weren't going back to Riverside or any place like it, was the single greatest moment of relief in my life. Jake was crying again, and this time I was crying too, and Tom just put his arms around both of us and said, "You boys did good. You survived something terrible and you came out the other side. Now, the real work begins." And he was right. Getting through the immediate crisis was one thing, but building an actual life after everything we'd been through, that was the real challenge. We graduated high school 2 years later, both of us managing to catch up academically and even do reasonably well. I discovered a talent for writing during those months in the cellar, and I ended up on the school newspaper, telling stories about the students everyone else overlooked. Jake found his calling in construction, working with Tom on various farm projects and discovering he had a real aptitude for building things, for taking raw materials and creating something useful and lasting. We'd spent 4 months building an underground shelter to survive, and now we were building actual futures. The cellar itself became something of a strange landmark in our story. Reporters wanted to see it, wanted to photograph the place where 2 teenage fugitives had survived a Montana winter. Tom eventually sealed it up properly, not destroying it, but making it safe and stable, preserving it as a reminder of what we'd been through. Sometimes, on difficult days when life felt overwhelming, I'd walk out to that spot behind the barn and just stand there, remembering what it felt like to be that desperate, that scared, that determined to survive at any cost. It kept me grounded, reminded me how far I'd come. My relationship with my parents slowly healed over time. It wasn't easy, and there were a lot of painful conversations about trust and disappointment, and the ways we'd all failed each other. But we worked at it. With the help of family therapy and a lot of patience on all sides, they came to understand that my initial crime, the breaking and entering that started this whole mess, had been a stupid teenager mistake, not some fundamental character flaw. And I came to understand how my escape had traumatized them, how those months of not knowing if I was alive or dead had aged them in ways I could see in the lines on their faces. We'd never get back what we'd lost, but we built something new in its place. Jake's path was similar, and having each other through all of it made the difference. We'd started this journey as cousins who barely knew each other, and we came out the other side as brothers in every way that mattered. We'd survived something together that most people couldn't even imagine, and that bond was unbreakable. Even now, years later, when life gets hard or complicated, we text each other the same message: remember the cellar. It's our shorthand for remembering that we've already survived the worst thing we could imagine, so whatever we're facing now, we can handle it. The community service work we did, as part of our sentence, ended up becoming something more meaningful than just checking boxes for the court. We spoke at schools, at juvenile facilities, at youth programs, telling our story honestly and without glorifying any of it. We talked about the initial mistakes that led to Riverside, about the desperation that led to our escape, about the months of barely surviving in an underground shelter. But we also talked about Tom Pritchard's kindness, about the importance of asking for help, about how running from your problems just creates new and often worse problems. Some kids listened, some didn't, but every once in a while, someone would come up to us afterward and say our story had helped them think differently about a decision they were facing, and those moments made everything worthwhile. I'm 23 now, working as a journalist in Seattle and living in my own apartment that feels almost luxurious compared to that underground shelter. Jake is 21, running his own small construction business in Montana, not far from Tom's farm. We both turned out okay, against all odds, because we found someone who believed we deserved a second chance, and because we were willing to stop running and face what we'd done. The reformatory system that failed us is slowly changing, partly because of cases like ours that exposed how broken it was. It's not perfect, and there's still a long way to go, but at least people are paying attention now. Looking back on those 4 months in the cellar, I don't feel pride exactly, but I don't feel shame either. We did what we thought we had to do to survive, and we made it through. We were kids who made mistakes, ran from the consequences, and eventually learned that the only way out is through. The shelter we built kept us alive through the worst winter of our lives, but the real shelter we found was in accepting help from someone who had no reason to care about us, but chose to anyway. That's the lesson I carry with me. Survival isn't just about being tough enough to endure on your own, it's about being brave enough to trust someone else when you can't do it alone anymore. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to our story. I want you to do me a favor, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because this channel is all about real stories from real people who've been through things that changed them. We're building a community here of people who understand that life is messy and complicated, and sometimes you make terrible decisions that lead to even worse situations. But we also understand that it's possible to come back from those situations, to learn from them, to grow into someone better than who you were. Drop a comment below and tell me your story. What did you learn from hearing about Marcus and Jake? Have you ever felt so trapped that running seemed like the only option? Have you ever been lucky enough to meet someone like Tom Pritchard who helped you when they didn't have to? This community is a judgment-free zone where we share, we support, and we learn from each other. So subscribe, comment, and be part of this conversation. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.